The highway stretched endlessly into the horizon, a ribbon of asphalt bathed in the pale, waning light of dusk. Matthew's car hummed along the surface, tires crunching softly against the loose gravel at the shoulder. The radio crackled faintly with static, struggling to pick up even the faintest station. He had driven this route countless times, a commute that should have been mundane, but tonight felt different. The sky, darkening with each passing mile, seemed heavier, pressing down on the road, the landscape twisting subtly at the edges of vision. Matthew glanced at the exit signs as they approached, each one glowing faintly under the dim streetlights. There was an exit ahead, exit 47, the one he normally took to reach the small town where his sister lived. But as he neared it, the sign seemed to warp, the letters slightly blurred as if seen through heat waves or rippling water. He slowed instinctively, squinting, thinking perhaps the wear of the metal or the fatigue of the long drive was playing tricks on him. The lane for the exit, however, seemed to vanish into shadow. No ramp appeared, nothing but asphalt stretched forward, uninterrupted. A sudden chill ran down his spine. The wind outside whispered against the car in low, almost human tones, teasing at the edges of perception. Matthew's knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. He tried to shake off the unease. Highways changed, signs got damaged or replaced. Maybe construction had forced the closure, though no warning signs had been visible. The highway continued forward, deceptively normal, yet unnerving in its smooth, endless monotony. The trees along the edge leaned inward slightly, casting long, finger-like shadows across the road. He topped the brakes lightly and glanced at his GPS. The screen flickered, then froze on a featureless grid. No roads, no names, no exit markers. Only a gray haze stretched across the digital map, a void where the familiar streets of the town should have appeared. The static of the radio intensified for a moment, then fell silent. Matthew swallowed hard, feeling the first prickling hint of fear. Something was wrong. The lane markers on the road ahead shimmered faintly, like the reflection of light on water. The highway seemed to stretch longer than it should, curving subtly yet impossibly, as though the asphalt were bending and folding on itself. Matthew's heartbeat quickened. He tried to turn around, to retrace his route, but the road behind him now looked unfamiliar, the exits he had passed moments ago replaced by stretches of black tarmac lined with trees that seemed taller and darker than memory allowed. He tried to convince himself. "It's late, I'm tired, I'm imagining it." He muttered the words aloud, voice quivering slightly, though he did not fully believe them. Still, the chill remained, crawling up the back of his neck and settling between his shoulder blades. The shadows at the roadside seemed to move just beyond his vision, indistinct forms brushing against the periphery of perception, gone the instant he tried to focus. A faint sound reached him, almost like a vehicle behind him, but impossibly faint, more felt than heard. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The road was empty, no headlights, no vehicle, yet the sensation of being followed persisted, a slow, deliberate pressure in the back of his mind. Matthew's hands trembled slightly on the wheel, and he took a deep breath to steady himself, trying to remind himself that he was alone. As the minutes dragged on, the darkness thickened unnaturally. The trees no longer cast mere shadows, they seemed to lean forward, their branches intertwining overhead to form a tunnel. The sky above, once fading from blue to indigo, had become a dense, impenetrable black. The road markers glowed faintly, eerily, but the glow seemed to come from the asphalt itself, not from any reflected light. Matthew's pulse pounded in his ears. He wanted to stop, to pull over, but a strange compulsion pushed him forward, urging him along the road deeper into the unknown stretch of highway. Then, almost imperceptibly, the exit sign reappeared, exit 47. It hung in the darkness ahead, identical to the one he expected, glowing with a pale, otherworldly light. Relief surged through him. Finally, he thought, a way to reach the familiar. But as he approached, the road beneath the sign seemed to dissolve into mist, a swirling gray fog that obscured any ramp or shoulder. The asphalt stretched forward, continuous, offering no path to leave. The exit existed and did not exist at the same time, a contradiction that twisted his mind with unease. Matthew slowed, gripping the wheel tightly, staring at the mist. A whisper reached him, faint at first, a sound carried on the wind through the trees. "Matthew," it said, soft, coaxing, unmistakably calling his name. He froze, scanning the darkened edges of the highway. No one was there. The voice sounded impossibly close, yet no figure could be seen. His pulse quickened. The voice repeated, "Matthew, this way." Fear gnawed at him, but curiosity and something deeper, a pull he could not resist, urged him forward. He pressed the accelerator, the tires humming against the asphalt, and drove straight into the fog that masked the missing exit. The fog wrapped around the car, dense and cold, swallowing the headlights, distorting the sound of the engine. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. The road beneath him remained smooth, endless, yet unfamiliar, as though it were no longer part of the world he had known. Shapes began to emerge through the mist. Not trees, not ordinary roadside markers, but outlines of structures, buildings that flickered in and out of clarity. They were vaguely familiar, a diner, a gas station, a motel, yet all wrong. The edges twisted and shifted like a reflection on disturbed water, architecture that defied logic, as though reality itself had been rewritten in subtle, insidious ways. Matthew's hands tightened on the wheel. His breath came in sharp, shallow gasps as he drove past the distorted structures, heart hammering with a mix of fear and awe. Then, in the distance, the fog thinned slightly, revealing an intersection with streetlights flickering pale blue and green. A small figure appeared at the corner, silhouetted against the dim glow. Matthew's heart skipped. The figure raised a hand, beckoning him. It was human-shaped, but too tall, too rigid in posture, and its movements unnervingly smooth. He blinked, and when his eyes opened again, the figure was gone. Only the intersection remained, unchanged, silent, and impossibly still. Matthew pressed on, trying to make sense of the impossible road stretching before him. Every familiar landmark he remembered from the highway was missing. The signs, the exits, the familiar curves of the asphalt, all gone, replaced by this alien yet subtly familiar world. The whispers returned, faint, layered with multiple tones now. "Matthew, you've come. Welcome." Each voice sounded human yet wrong, almost mechanical in its cadence. His pulse raced, and the compulsion to follow them grew stronger, magnetic, terrifying. As the mist began to thin, Matthew noticed the trees on either side of the highway. Their bark glimmered faintly, almost wet under the pale light, and patterns formed in the surface. Not random knots or bark textures, but shapes resembling faces. Eyes, mouths, noses, scaring, shifting into the wood when he looked directly. His hands trembled on the wheel, knuckles white, and a cold sweat ran down his back. The exit he sought, the world he knew, seemed further away than ever. He realized he had crossed into something else, a place that mimicked his reality but twisted it, reshaped it according to rules he could not understand. The whispers continued, now rising in intensity, layering his own thoughts with suggestions, urging him to leave the car, to step into the mist, to surrender to the unknown. Matthew gripped the steering wheel tighter, the headlights cutting a narrow path through the fog. He understood with bone-deep clarity that this missing exit did not merely lead somewhere else. It led to another world, a place where reality bent to the will of something patient, ancient, and hungry for the living. And somewhere beyond the veil of mist and twisted highway, something waited for him, observing, learning, and calling him forward. Matthew's tires hummed against the smooth asphalt, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the thick silence of the fog-enshrouded highway. The mist clung to the edges of the car, curling around the headlights in ghostly tendrils that obscured everything beyond a few feet. The air had grown colder, carrying the faint metallic tang of wet earth and something indefinably older than roads, older than man. Every breath Matthew drew was sharp, forcing him to swallow back the rising panic that threatened to overwhelm him. The world beyond the missing exit wasn't just unfamiliar, it was alive, and it felt aware of him. The highway stretched forward in an impossible continuity, smooth asphalt that gave no hint of curves or turns he recognized. Trees lined the road, gnarled and unnaturally tall, their branches arching over the pavement like skeletal fingers. Their shadows flickered with the faint glow of the headlights, shifting and twisting, forming shapes that Matthew thought he recognized. Faces appeared for a moment in the bark, a mother, a friend, a stranger, only to dissolve back into the rough wood as if the forest itself were breathing, reshaping reality with every exhale. He glanced at the side mirror. The familiar road behind him was gone, replaced by a wall of gray mist that pulsed softly, as though breathing in rhythm with his own heartbeat. Panic threatened to rise again, but Matthew forced himself to breathe, reminding himself that he could not succumb. The exit he had sought, the highway he had known, had disappeared, leaving only this surreal stretch of road suspended between reality and something else entirely. The whispers began again, low at first, then layering upon themselves, voices overlapping in haunting harmony. "Matthew, come, you've arrived." He gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles whitening, and pressed on. Through the fog, structures began to emerge, dim and wavering. A diner appeared first, its windows dark except for the faint reflection of headlights on cracked glass. Its neon sign flickered weakly, displaying a name that shifted each time he glanced at it. Haven's Rest. No, Meridian Diner. No, something else entirely. Matthew's stomach churned. The place was familiar, yet wrong, distorted, as if memory itself had been used as the blueprint but warped by something alien. The car moved slowly, the engine's hum swallowed almost entirely by the oppressive silence. Shadows shifted along the edges of the buildings. Matthew could not tell if they were animals, figures, or illusions. Occasionally, the faintest sound reached him, a footstep behind the diner, a door creaking, whispers of laughter, and each time he turned, there was nothing. The structure seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting subtly, alive in a way that made rational thought impossible. Then he saw a street sign tilted slightly in the fog, Main Street. Relief and dread mingled as he realized this should have been his town, his familiar route home, but the buildings lining the street were wrong. Windows were oddly shaped, doors led nowhere, and the pavement was cracked with intricate patterns that shifted if he stared too long. Shapes moved within the fog, tall, thin figures that seemed to mimic the forms of people he knew, but blurred at the edges, features indistinct yet human enough to tug at the memory of familiarity. Matthew slowed, hesitant. The whispers grew louder, threading through the fog and scraping at his mind. "This way, Matthew. Don't be afraid. It's waiting for you." The words carried a seduction impossible to ignore. Something in the back of his mind, a deep, instinctive part, urged him to follow, to step off the car, to leave the safety of the familiar vehicle. He clenched his fists on the wheel, forcing himself to focus. He would not allow whatever this was to lure him blindly. A figure appeared at the end of the street, silhouetted against a flickering lamppost. At first glance, it was a child, waving, beckoning him forward. Matthew's heart lurched. The child's face was impossibly familiar, yet distorted, pale in the fog with eyes that reflected the moonlight in a way that made them appear empty, like twin pools of liquid shadow. Matthew's pulse hammered in his ears. He wanted to turn the wheel, to flee, yet something compelled him to move closer. The figure raised a hand again, slowly, deliberately, inviting him forward. He blinked, and suddenly the child was gone. The street stretched on endlessly, devoid of life except for the faint outlines of buildings that shimmered, flickered, and reshaped themselves subtly each time he looked. The air had grown thick with a suffocating density, as though each breath drew in more fog, more weight, more awareness. He realized with a shiver that the highway beyond the missing exit was not just a road, it was a threshold, a liminal space between what he knew and something incomprehensible. Matthew pressed on, careful to keep the car centered on the asphalt. Shadows shifted at the periphery of his vision, fleeting and indecipherable, whispering names and phrases he did not recognize. Occasionally, a voice would mimic someone he loved, familiar tones urging him closer, calling him by name. His chest tightened with both longing and fear. The world beyond the exit was alive, learning, anticipating. It fed of recognition, of memory, of desire. Suddenly, a low hum resonated through the air. The fog thickened, swirling in eddies that seemed almost sentient, curling around the car like the fingers of some invisible hand. Shapes appeared within the mist, buildings stretching impossibly tall, streets bending at unnatural angles, and figures that flickered between human and something else entirely. The whispers now merged into a chorus, voices overlapping, teasing, coaxing, and warning simultaneously. Matthew felt his mind strain under the pressure, memories warping, familiar landmarks betraying him with subtle distortions. The car slowed to a crawl as the world seemed to fold in on itself. Buildings, shadows, and figures converged in ways that defied geometry, creating corridors that led nowhere and streets that looped impossibly. Matthew's knuckles were white, his breath shallow and quick. He realized that the missing exit had not just transported him to another world, it had transported him to another world, one where the laws of reality bent according to an intelligence he could not comprehend. A sound, faint at first, reached him over the hum of the engine and the oppressive silence of the fog. It was music, distant yet familiar, a lullaby his mother used to sing. His throat tightened. The melody, so sweet and real, tugged at his memory, filling him with longing and grief. The whispers intensified, layering the melody with faint voices of friends and loved ones. His eyes darted around the shifting street, seeking the source, but the fog obscured everything. Matthew pressed the accelerator slightly, trying to escape the pull, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly. Every step forward brought him deeper into the fog, deeper into the mirrored, distorted world. The child's silhouette appeared at the end of the street, again, smaller, now flickering in and out of existence, as though it existed on the edge of perception. Matthew's chest tightened. He understood with sudden clarity that the missing exit was not merely a place to reach, it was a gateway, and the inhabitants of this world, whatever they were aware of him, learning from him, manipulating him, shaping the space around him to test his resolve. Matthew gripped the steering wheel tighter, and he whispered to himself, "I will not follow blindly. I will not be taken." The fog pulsed, the figures wavered, the whispers layered into a maddening symphony, but he pressed on. Ahead, the faint glow of something different pierced the mist, a light unlike the pale, flickering luminescence of the street lamps, something warmer, steadier, almost inviting. He realized it was a potential exit, a chance to find a path back, yet the pull of the fog, the whispers, and the distorted figures clawed at him, urging him to surrender. Matthew swallowed hard, knowing that every decision here was critical. The missing highway exit had brought him to another world, yes, but he understood now that leaving would require more than just driving. He would need awareness, patience, and courage, and the strength to resist the compulsion to follow illusions of what he loved or remembered. The fog began to thin slightly, revealing the warped shapes of buildings stretching into impossible angles. The figures receded into the shadows, though the whispers remained, faint but persistent. Matthew adjusted the car, centering himself on the asphalt, and pressed forward towards the strange, steady light. Every nerve in his body screamed with tension, but he knew there was no turning back. He had entered a world that mimicked reality and twisted it, and the only way forward was to confront it, step by deliberate step, and hope the path led him home. Matthew pressed forward, the headlights cutting narrow slices through the dense fog. The world around him continued to shift unnervingly, buildings bending and stretching as though made of soft clay rather than concrete, streets looping back on themselves in impossible ways. He gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles white, and tried to keep his mind anchored to what he knew: the feel of the steering wheel, the hum of the engine, the smell of the air inside the car. Beyond that, everything else was untrustworthy, a labyrinth of illusion built to trap and manipulate. The highway had transformed completely. Gone were the familiar exits and mile markers, replaced by stretches of asphalt that seemed to pulse faintly, like the veins of some colossal, unseen organism. Shadows moved at the edges of perception, flickering between solid and insubstantial, forming shapes that were vaguely human but impossibly tall or oddly thin. Every time Matthew tried to focus, the shapes warped, leaving only the unsettling sense that he was being watched. A streetlight appeared ahead, flickering weakly in the fog. Beneath it stood a figure, motionless, almost statuesque. As Matthew's car approached, the fog parted just enough to reveal the figure more clearly. It was a woman. No, it wasn't exactly her. Her face resembled someone he had known in passing, a coworker from years ago, yet the expression was wrong, frozen in a slight, unnatural smile. Her posture was rigid, her limbs elongated subtly. When she raised a hand in greeting, Matthew's stomach knotted. He felt the tug of familiarity, a memory he could not quite place being used against him. The whispers rose again, soft at first, then layered upon themselves until the fog seemed alive with voices. Come, follow, you know this place. Each syllable was tailored to Matthew's subconscious, dredging up memories and emotions he had long buried. He forced himself to focus on the steering wheel, on the road beneath the tires. Recognition, he realized, was a dangerous trap here. The highway, the fog, the figures, all of it fed on what he remembered and what he longed for. A side road appeared, faintly illuminated, almost invisible beneath the shifting fog. For a fleeting moment, Matthew thought he saw the exit to the world he knew, a faint glimmer of normalcy in the warped landscape. He swerved slightly, trying to align the car with the faint path, but the asphalt under his tires rippled like water, stretching forward, bending the road and erasing the side street as he approached. Panic surged. The missing exit was not just elusive, it was adaptive, aware of his attempts to leave, reshaping itself to ensure he remained within its grasp. Matthew forced himself to slow, the car crawling forward at a pace that felt both agonizingly slow and impossibly fast. The fog thickened, pressing against the windshield, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The figures appeared again, emerging from the mist in groups now, all vaguely human yet distorted in ways that made Matthew's skin crawl. Some wore faces he recognized, old friends, neighbors, even family members, each altered subtly, twisted enough to trigger unease while still retaining enough familiarity to evoke longing. One figure stepped into the road directly ahead. Matthew slammed on the brakes, heart hammering, tires squealing against the asphalt. The woman's face, which had seemed frozen in that unnatural smile, now shifted before his eyes, melting into a perfect imitation of his mother. Her eyes glimmered with unplaceable emotion, neither fully alive nor fully dead. She whispered, barely audible over the hum of the engine, "Matthew, you should come with me. It's safe here." Matthew's pulse thundered in his ears. He forced himself to breathe, to remind himself that this was not real. None of it was real. The voices, the figures, the impossible shapes of the world, they were designed to manipulate, to draw him in, to trap him. He gripped the wheel, knuckles white, and pressed the accelerator. The car surged forward, skimming past the figure, which flickered and warped like smoke in its sudden displacement. The road ahead seemed to fold inward, the asphalt bending subtly, forming a narrowing corridor bordered by walls of fog and twisted shapes. Shadows writhed along the edges, forming faces that contorted in pain, joy, fear, or longing, shifting too quickly for Matthew to focus on any single one. He realized that the highway beyond the missing exit was not static. It was conscious, learning from him, adapting to his fears and desires, shaping reality itself to entrap him. A low hum began, resonating through the car, as if the asphalt itself vibrated with awareness. The figures ahead became more numerous, appearing in clusters, their outlines flickering in and out of existence, calling to him, tugging at his subconscious. His chest tightened as a melody reached him, faint and distant, a lullaby his mother had sung when he was a child. The familiarity was almost unbearable, the pull toward the figures irresistible. He clenched his teeth, forcing himself to focus. Recognition was a weapon here, and he would not let it claim him. Suddenly, the fog parted slightly, revealing a stretch of road that seemed more solid, more real, as though a path existed beyond the adoptive nightmare around him. Matthew steered toward it cautiously, aware that the highway might shift again at any moment. The shadows flickered in protest, twisting into grotesque shapes and then melting back into the fog. The whispers, layered and insistent, tried to coax him back, calling names, repeating memories, pulling at the ache in his chest. He drove forward, every nerve alert, every sense screaming. The world around him continued to warp, but he clung to the fragments of reality he could trust, the feel of the tires on the asphalt, the pulse of the engine beneath him, the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. He knew that surrendering to the illusions would trap him here forever. Every figure, every shape, every whisper was a test designed to exploit his longing for the familiar, for the safety of the world he had lost. Then he saw it, a faint glimmer ahead, steady and warm against the cold, shifting fog. The light cut through the mist, illuminating a stretch of highway that appeared solid, real, anchored in reality. Matthew's chest surged with cautious hope. The world beyond the missing exit was still a trap, still alive and aware, but a path forward existed. One step at a time, he realized, and he could reclaim his freedom. Matthew pressed the accelerator, moving toward the light, heart hammering, aware that the shadows and figures would attempt one final effort to pull him back. The fog began to thin slightly, the twisted, impossible shapes of buildings and trees dissolving into the distance. The whispers diminished, replaced by the subtle sound of the engine and the wind against the car. For the first time since entering the missing exit, Matthew felt a glimmer of control. He had survived the illusions, resisted the pull of recognition, and pressed forward into a corridor of reality within the nightmare. But he knew the forest of fog and shadows waited ahead, always patient, always aware, always ready to adapt to the next step of his journey. The highway beyond the missing exit was a living entity, a predator of perception, and he had only just begun to navigate its heart. Matthew's car glided forward along the highway, the headlights slicing through the lingering fog in long, narrow beams. The road beneath him seemed more stable now, solid in texture and alignment, but the world around him had grown stranger than ever. Shadows shifted unnaturally at the edges of perception, stretching across the asphalt like liquid tendrils. The shapes of buildings appeared and disappeared in the fog, some looking as though they were constructed from warped mirrors, reflecting parts of the highway back at him in impossible angles. Every glance threatened to disorient him, to make him question whether he was moving forward or trapped in some looping illusion. The air was cold and heavy, pressing against him from all sides. The whispers had not disappeared. They now surrounded him completely, layered upon each other like a haunting symphony. "Matthew, this way. Don't stop. Come closer." Each voice carried a different timbre, some familiar, some alien. The effect was maddening. He clenched his jaw, gripping the wheel, forcing his eyes to focus on the narrow path ahead, ignoring the layers of sound that seemed to penetrate directly into his mind. Structures emerged through the fog intermittently. A gas station flickered into view, its lights dim and uneven, casting long shadows that wavered across the pavement. The sign above the pumps flickered incoherently, letters twisting and morphing. Serve, save, sure. Matthew squinted, trying to make sense of the message, but it shifted too quickly. He understood instinctively that the highway beyond the missing exit responded to his perception, to his memory, to his doubts, reshaping itself in real time to test him. A figure appeared in the distance, standing at the edge of the road. At first glance, it resembled his father, tall and still, eyes shadowed under the brim of a hat. Matthew's chest tightened. The figure lifted a hand slightly, not fully beckoning, but motioning gently toward the fog. The familiarity was almost irresistible. Matthew's mind rebelled against the compulsion, reminding him this was not real, that recognition here was a trap. His pulse surged as he forced his gaze forward, refusing to yield to the instinct to stop. The whispers intensified, overlapping, repeating phrases from the figure's lips in a chorus that grew maddening. "Come, it's safe, you've been missed, follow, trust." Each syllable was carefully tuned to the echoes of Matthew's longing, dredging up memory after memory he had thought settled, twisting his emotions into vulnerability. The forest of fog and shadow beyond the missing exit did not simply rely on fear, it preyed on desire, on the ache of loss, on the human need for connection. Matthew's chest tightened further, but he refused to slow. He would not be caught. The road itself seemed to pulse beneath the tires, subtle waves radiating outward, as if the asphalt had a heartbeat and it synchronized with his own. He forced himself to stay centered, driving with deliberate care, noting the small details, the friction of the tires against the pavement, the metallic tang of cold air rushing through the open vents, the rhythm of his own pulse. Each detail grounded him, provided an anchor in a world that constantly tried to warp and unmake him. Ahead, the fog began to part slightly, revealing a corridor of buildings that seemed impossibly tall, their tops vanishing into the mist above. Windows reflected the faint glow of headlights, but the reflections were wrong. Matthew caught glimpses of his own face, but distorted, stretched, hollowed, with eyes that blinked in the wrong rhythm. His stomach churned as he realized that the highway beyond the missing exit was not merely a physical space, but a mirror of his own mind, bending reality around him to test the limits of perception and sanity. A sudden sound caught his attention, a distant laughter, familiar yet wrong. Matthew froze briefly, straining to identify it. It carried the timbre of someone he once knew, a friend from childhood, whose memory had lingered faintly in the corners of his mind. The sound echoed along the corridor, multiplying and distorting, turning into dozens of overlapping voices. He shook his head violently, trying to shake off the sensation, but the effect was disorienting, as though the laughter existed both outside and inside him at once. He pressed the accelerator gently, moving forward, and the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly. Buildings warped and twisted as he passed, some appearing to bend inward toward the car, others shifting away as if avoiding him. The whispers now formed coherent phrases, repeating memories and longings Matthew had tried to bury. "You shouldn't have left. Come back. It's your fault. Follow me." Each word, carefully chosen, tugged at his psyche, testing his resolve. He forced himself to focus on the asphalt, on the act of driving, on the steady rhythm of the car beneath him. Shapes flickered at the periphery, dark forms that resembled people but with subtle abnormalities, limbs bent unnaturally, faces stretched too wide, eyes too large, smiles frozen in impossible ways. Matthew understood these were not real, yet they were horrifyingly convincing, exploiting his brain's natural tendency to recognize human forms. The forest of fog, the living highway, seemed to observe, catalog, and manipulate him, aware of every micro-expression, every hesitation, every thought that crossed his mind. Then he saw a curve ahead, faintly illuminated by the headlights. The road bent sharply to the right, lined by trees whose trunks shimmered with an almost wet luminescence. Shadows moved along the branches, faces appearing briefly, mouths opening in silent screams before dissolving into bark. Matthew's chest ached with fear and awe. He realized he had entered the true heart of the world beyond the missing exit, a place where perception and reality intertwined, where the highway was no longer merely a road, but an extension of the forest's consciousness, a corridor that bent time, space, and memory to trap him and study him. The figure of his father appeared again, closer now, emerging from the fog. Matthew's breath caught. This time the figure did not move. It simply stood, observing, waiting. The whispers were louder, layering over the pulse of the road, over the hum of the engine, echoing inside Matthew's skull. "Come, it's safer. You belong here." The voice resonated with longing, with memory, with seduction, but Matthew's awareness had grown. He could separate illusion from reality now, recognize the manipulation, and resist the compulsion. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, focusing on the narrow strip of road ahead, and forced himself to drive past the figure. The shadow recoiled slightly, wavering, dissolving into mist as he passed. The corridor stretched ahead, still warped, still alive, but Matthew understood one vital truth. The highway beyond the missing exit could twist, could mimic, could manipulate, but it required his acquiescence to trap him fully.
Awareness and intent were his only defenses. The fog began to thin further as he approached a faint glow in the distance, a steady, warm one against the cold, shifting landscape. Buildings and shadows receded slightly, leaving only the narrow road and the persistent whispers, now quieter, almost hesitant. Matthew's chest heaved with exhaustion, yet there was a spark of hope. He had resisted the pull of memory and desire, navigated the illusions, and survived the corridor of shadows. The path ahead, though still uncertain, promised a chance to reach the real world beyond this living nightmare. Matthew drove forward deliberately, every sense alert, aware that the world beyond the missing exit remained patient, eternal, and observant. The highway had tested him, shaped him, and forced him to confront his own perceptions, but he had endured. Ahead, the faint, warm glow continued to beckon, promising an exit, a way back to reality, if he could maintain his focus and resist the seduction of the illusions that lingered, always watching, always waiting. Matthew's hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles ached, his eyes fixed on the faint, warm glow ahead. It was unlike the cold, shifting fog and flickering shadows of the corridor he had just traversed. The light seemed steady, solid, an anchor in a world that had continually warped beneath him. Yet even as hope surged, a deep unease gnawed at him. The highway beyond the missing exit had been alive, aware, adoptive. It had tested him at every step. He knew instinctively that this final stretch would demand everything he had left: focus, courage, and the ability to resist the seductive pull of familiarity and memory. The fog thinned further, revealing warped trees that bent toward the asphalt like cathedral arches. Their bark shimmered faintly in the headlights, forming patterns that seemed almost intentional, as though guiding him toward the glow. Shadows moved along the trunks, forming faces he recognized: friends, neighbors, even family, but all subtly wrong. Their smiles were frozen, eyes glimmered with unnatural light, and limbs bent in impossible angles. Every time he glanced at them, they shifted, reacting to his attention, testing his awareness. Whispers swirled around him, layered and persistent. "You belong here. You're almost home. Follow us." Each syllable dug into his mind, tugging at memories he had tried to suppress, dredging up longing and regret. Matthew's chest tightened. The illusion of safety, of connection, was nearly irresistible, yet he pressed onward. Recognition, he reminded himself, was the weapon this world used. Awareness was his shield. He repeated it like a mantra: "Awareness is my shield. Awareness is my shield." A figure emerged directly in his lane, its outline vaguely human. Matthew slammed on the brakes, heart hammering, tires squealing against the asphalt. The figure's face flickered. First his mother, then a childhood friend, then his father, all in rapid succession. It raised a hand as if to beckon, but Matthew forced his gaze forward. The figure shimmered, warped, and dissolved into the mist, retreating into the shadows it had emerged from. The highway responded immediately, twisting subtly, reshaping itself, adopting to keep him within the corridor of illusion. He pressed the accelerator again, the car gliding forward along the narrow strip of road. The glow ahead grew brighter, warmer, and more stable, a contrast to the ever-shifting fog and warped structures. Yet, even as he approached, Matthew could sense the lingering pull of the highway, the forest of shadows, the adoptive intelligence that had been testing him. Every shape, every whisper, every flicker of light was a potential trap. He forced himself to maintain focus, to trust the feel of the road beneath him rather than the images projected by the living nightmare around him. As he neared the glow, the asphalt beneath the car began to ripple subtly, like water disturbed by wind. The buildings at the edges of the fog shimmered, bending inward, forming a funnel that seemed to direct him toward a final point of exit. Shadows stretched long and thin, faces pressed into the warped bark of trees seeming to plead, to scream, to warn him against the path. The whispers layered into a crescendo, voices overlapping in impossible harmonies. "Come. You'll never leave. Stay. Follow." Each word was carefully calibrated to exploit his memory, his grief, his desire for the familiar. Matthew's chest tightened. The illusion of safety, of connection, was nearly irresistible, yet he pressed onward. Recognition, he reminded himself, was the weapon this world used. Awareness was his shield. He repeated it like a mantra: "Awareness is my shield. Awareness is my shield." A sudden motion caught his eye at the edge of the light. The child figure he had seen earlier, the one that mimicked someone from his past, appeared again, standing, still, silent. Matthew's stomach churned. The figure's face was hollow, eerily reflective, yet somehow familiar. It raised a hand once more, and the whispers coalesced into a single, insistent voice. "You belong here. Come with us." Matthew exhaled slowly, chest aching, and forced himself to stare past it, focusing entirely on the road ahead and the steady glow of the exit. The figure's form flickered and wavered as if uncertain, unable to sustain the illusion against his unwavering awareness. It dissolved into mist once more, leaving only the faint shimmer of residual fog along the roadside. The whispers continued, but their force had diminished, a reminder that the highway could shape reality only if he allowed it to. The glow expanded gradually, revealing a stretch of highway that seemed entirely ordinary. The fog was gone here, replaced by cool, crisp night air. Trees no longer leaned unnaturally, and the shadows receded into the distance. Matthew's pulse gradually slowed, but his body remained tense, every nerve alert to the lingering possibility of deception. The adaptive intelligence of the highway, the living world beyond the missing exit, had been patient and precise, but awareness and intent had allowed him to resist its full control. He glanced at the rearview mirror. The corridor of shadows and warped buildings stretched back into the distance, shrouded in mist, endlessly shifting, a silent and eternal observer. The figures that had haunted him remained at the periphery, their forms flickering in and out, unable to advance beyond the threshold of the glow. He realized that the highway beyond the missing exit did not allow escape easily. It was patient, eternal, and adaptive, but not invincible against one who could recognize the illusion and refuse its seduction.
The glow expanded gradually, revealing a stretch of highway that seemed entirely ordinary. The fog was gone here, replaced by cool, crisp night air. Trees no longer leaned in unnaturally, and the shadows receded into the distance. Matthew's pulse gradually slowed, but his body remained tense, every nerve alert to the lingering possibility of deception. The adaptive intelligence of the highway, the living worlds beyond the missing exit, had been patient and precise, but awareness and intent had allowed him to resist its full control. He glanced at the rearview mirror. The corridor of shadows and warped buildings stretched back into the distance, shrouded in mist, endlessly shifting, a silent and eternal observer. The figures that had haunted him remained at the periphery, their forms flickering in and out, unable to advance beyond the threshold of the glow. He realized that the highway beyond the missing exit did not allow escape easily. It was patient, eternal, and adaptive, but not invincible against one who could recognize the illusion and refuse its seduction. Matthew's hands relaxed slightly on the wheel as he drove into the steady light. The familiar signs of the real highway began to appear. Exit markers glimmered under the headlights, mile numbers returned, and the blacktop beneath him felt anchored, real, solid. The whispers had faded entirely, replaced by the hum of tires on asphalt and the whisper of wind past the open windows. Relief surged through him, tempered by lingering fear. He knew the highway beyond the missing exit would wait, patient and eternal, for the next traveler who might not recognize the illusion until it was too late. The first hint of dawn broke along the horizon, bathing the ordinary highway in pale light. Matthew's car rolled steadily along the familiar lanes, the sky above transitioning from deep indigo to soft gray. The fog, the whispers, the adaptive corridors of shadow, all were behind him, receding into memory, yet the lesson remained indelible. Awareness, courage, and intent were his only defenses against the manipulations of the world beyond the missing exit. Finally, he saw the familiar green exit sign for the town he had intended to reach. Relief washed over him, mingled with exhaustion and lingering dread. He slowed, taking the ramp toward normalcy, glancing back once at the highway behind him. The fog had vanished entirely, leaving only empty asphalt and the dim outlines of ordinary trees. Nothing moved, no whispers, no figures, only the ordinary world, unwarped and unyielding. Matthew exhaled slowly, his body shaking, and continued toward the town, carrying with him the knowledge of what he had survived. The highway beyond the missing exit was patient, eternal, and alive, but he had endured. He had resisted the pull of familiarity, navigated the shifting world, and reclaimed the road to reality. The missing exit still existed somewhere in the folds of fog and shadow, waiting for another traveler, another memory, another desire to exploit. But he had survived, and that survival was proof that awareness, intent, and courage could pierce even the most seductive illusions. The sun rose higher, casting light over the asphalt, illuminating the ordinary highway, the ordinary town, and the ordinary world he had almost lost. Yet somewhere deep in his mind, Matthew knew that the world beyond the missing exit remained, patient, eternal, and ever watching, ready to test the next traveler who wandered too far into the fog.